Good afternoon, everybody. I think this thing miraculously is on. Everything's showing up. Just want to say that besides Melanie's other wonderful attributes, she's an extremely scary session chair. So we are all living in fear here, and there's a timer there and all sorts of stuff. So I hope you'll forgive us if we rush over a couple of key points. I mean, there's a lot in this sort of proposal. And I'm very conscious, having presented in many places, that there are inbuilt oppositions to ideas of this kind. So it's very tempting to try and deal with all of those arguments in the course of going through, and you can't, of course. So I'm deliberately trying to choose who to annoy here today, and we hope that in the course of the afternoon we can deal with some of the difficulties. You'll see we've titled this thing The Role of Curriculum Reform. It really means structural reform in improving graduate output, by which I mean numbers, and outcomes, which usually refers to the qualitative aspects. And this is our proposal. As Melanie has said, the challenge is actually a very simple one in many ways. We need to improve our graduate production. Horrible term, but graduate production. Number, quality. Attributes that suit the contemporary world as far as possible, and crucially, equity. And I'd like to make the point right up front that this, of course, is for all forms of development. Graduates don't only fill jobs, they create jobs, etc., in all spheres. But it's also hugely about revitalizing our whole education system, which, as you know, seriously needs revitalizing it. How are we going to turn around our school system, our FET colleges, even provide the next generation of academics if we do not have a much stronger supply of good graduates from all of our communities? I can't see it happening. Some of you may have read that very horrible, well done report from Nick Taylor, but horrible findings recently on the performance of grade 5s in many schools, which we sort of know that the students can't do the basics, but the terrifying thing is that the teachers don't know how to teach those basics. So how on earth, colleagues, do we start to turn that around? We have to break the vicious circle of poor schooling, producing poor candidates for higher education, etc., etc., etc. We've got to find a way in to break that vicious circle. I want to start also with some quite hard-nosed ideas here about where we are going, talking about effectiveness and efficiency, which doesn't come readily from an educationist. But I think one of the huge questions we're going to have to ask ourselves is, how do we grow our graduate production? There really are only two ways. Either we push more students into the system up front, which is what is being attempted at the moment, more of the same, or we try really hard to improve the effectiveness of our teaching and learning process, which in turn produces efficiency. It follows as the night the day. So we have to ask ourselves then, which model are we going to follow? You will know that the National Development Plan and the Green Paper seriously propose very large increases in higher education to 1.5 or 1.6 million from approximately the million that we have at the moment. That is for 2030, but it's a very serious proposal. Is it going to happen or not? Is the money going to come from the state to be able to do that? I don't know if we've got government people here today, but I have not seen any evidence of these proposals being costed, because I want to show you some figures a little bit later on to show that if they were costed, we would be quaking in our boots, because it does not seem realistic at all, unless we find a way to make our whole system a great deal more efficient. And somehow, as I say, we have to break into that circle. Subsidy is likely, if anything, to go down with growth, because the amount of money, the drain on the fiscus becomes very strong. And a number of institutions are already feeling the cold breeze of this kind of thing. So I want to argue then that whatever scenario we follow, whether we grow or whether we stay the way we are, the only way for us viably to improve our graduate production is to make this teaching and learning process of ours more effective for the majority of the student body, and it's not that now, as you will see. Effectiveness produces efficiency, and it can help us to reduce the quite unsustainable loss of human and material resources that we are going through. We can quantify that in terms of subsidy that does not produce graduates. And we can show good figures that it is approximately 5 billion every year that is going on unproductive subsidy. It was estimated years ago by the HSRC that it was 4.5 billion. So we're not far out with our figures. That is a great deal of money. It is actually not coming to fruition. So what are we doing now? The task team has come up with what we regard as a serious proposal that is practicable, that is not in the distant future, it can be done, and that is affordable, in spite of what our intuitions might say. And it's about this flexible curriculum structure. Many of you will know, but just to say, the key point here is brutally practical. We need to increase the time on task that our students have in order to learn, to get to the exit points that we want to get to. We need to increase that, and that time on task has to be mediated by human beings, or if we are very clever in some ways online, it's still by human beings. We don't know the capacity there yet. But as the norm for our basic degrees and diplomas, we are arguing that we need to increase the duration. It's actually time on task, but in practice it's duration in years at the moment. We also need to provide for those students who can complete, and by the way, that's black as well as white, of course, in less than the standard time, not to be held back. Why would we want to hold people back and pay for the privilege of doing that? People, of course, there are inequities, but that is reflecting the inequalities in our society deeply. So if people can move more rapidly, they must be allowed to do so. And finally, the proposal is that we are not incorporating the honours year or pushing up the exit standards. We're keeping the exit standards more or less as they are because we need a lot more effort just to get there. We've got to get there well. So that's why we're saying improve a little bit, maybe if we can, but by and large use a different time scale to get there. And we have found this to be feasible and affordable, and it will improve graduate output and outcomes, and indeed, colleagues, it is more cost effective than our current system. And I think we can show that. So, because many of you will have read this or at least heard this, I'm going to whiz through the key points of the argument. One is that the situation at the moment is so wasteful as to be unsustainable. The second one, that I'll have to argue, is that the school system, which everybody blames, and the FET system are not going to be able to deliver what we need to get higher education out of this hole that it is in. Thirdly, we have to say, why focus on curriculum? And fourthly, we have to look at issues of implementability. Right, so I'm going to go through this quickly. Our participation, access in higher education is low in relation not only to the first world, where it's hugely low, if I may say, but in terms of our comparator countries, and it's racially skewed. The basic fact here is that white participation is still 4 times higher than black, African and coloured, and that the net effect of this is that only about 10% of the African and coloured youth population are getting into higher education at all. Now, how can that be when intelligence or educability is randomly distributed across populations, and many other countries aspire to educating a good 50%? So what's our problem? Why can we not do at least a bit better than we are doing? And the upside of that is that because it's a small intake, and by and large the people who are coming in have the highest levels of attainment in the system, it doesn't mean there are not many other good students out there, highest level of attainment, they should have very high potential to succeed. We ought to be able to do well with that group. But unfortunately, we are not. The performance remains stubbornly poor. Just these 3 headline numbers here. 27% of our contact students leave out UNISA because distance education students generally take much longer. 27%, 1 in 4 of our contact students graduate in the time they are meant to. That means that 1 in 4 follow the curriculum as it was designed. The other 3 do not, and often end up with quite chaotic curriculum. Half of the intake will never graduate at all. And we calculate that by looking at patterns of length of time in higher education and return to higher education. Half will never graduate. If you put UNISA in, it's 55%. And since only 10% of African and coloured youth come in, and more than half fall away, only 5% of African and coloured youth succeed in any form of higher education. Colleagues, it's a no-brainer to say that this is not sustainable. No wonder we have shortages in all kinds of areas. So we have a low participation, high attrition system. I say that because there are other high attrition systems, like the US, for example. Only it has an 88% participation rate. So it's a completely different ballgame from ours, where we're taking in a cream, a selected group, and losing half of them. And it affects the majority already of our current student intake. And imagine what the case will be if we grow to 1.5 million. Because the average level of preparation that students will come in with will drop. Here's a lovely picture that illustrates our challenge completely. It's time to graduate. The 3 columns in the different little clusters there are just different degree types with diplomas in the middle. And you will see that regulation time on the left, that's the 27%. And then the others, they dwindle somewhat. If you add them together, they're much the same, graduating in N+1 or N+2. But our problem is on the right-hand side. Remember I said 50% of our students will never make it. Few of those in those little columns will graduate at some time, but the majority will not. So our challenge is quite starkly depicted. We have to move students from that right-hand set of columns further left. We've got to do it. That is completely unacceptable wastage, not just of money, but of human talent. How do we account for this? Well, it's a long story, but I just want to say that we have taken full account of the factors that go into this kind of situation. Of course, there's poverty. Of course, there are many affective or emotional factors that are involved. But what we see is these things are often interlinked anyway, and that academic or teaching and learning related issues are at the heart of the matter. Why would they not be, colleagues, when that's exactly what we complain about in our schools and in the very difficult circumstances under which many of our students grow up? So, of course, that is a huge problem. Oh, sorry, wrong thing there altogether. So we are looking here in this study at largely the teaching and learning related factors. Student underpreparedness is something we talk about all the time, and it's a useful sort of concept. It takes some of the blame away from the students, if you like. But it's also not a very helpful concept in other ways. Underpreparedness, after all, is a highly relative thing. You're underprepared for something. You might well be prepared for something else. So in fact, our challenge is, if we're not going to write off our youth, is to get an understanding of realistically what is it that they are prepared for. What can we build on from schools and all of that stuff in higher education to enable students to realize their undoubtedly high collective potential. So it's far better expressed, this thing, as a mismatch between different educational phases. And by the way, it's not just education, it's about home backgrounds and university expectations and so on. But there's a mismatch between what we expect in higher education and what we are actually getting. It's so clear, we've known about it for 30 years. We sometimes call it the articulation gap, the failure to join up. And a gap is a very nice way of seeing it, because in fact a gap can and should be closed from both sides. We are not helpless in this. And in fact, that's what really needs to be done. We have to be realistic about which side can more readily close it. Given that education is or meant to be a continuum, we look at the whole sector, right, we must look very hard-nosedly at which parts of that sector are going to be able, in practice, to deal with that gap. And I'm afraid I'm going through this very rapidly, but our analysis and many other people's analysis of the pre-tertiary sectors, schools and the embryonic FET colleges, is that they will not be able to make a significant contribution to that, bridging that gap in current circumstances. There's a number for you. It's quite easy to calculate that if higher education were to, thank you, if higher education were to continue business as usual with a reasonable degree of effectiveness, let's say 70% instead of 50, we would need another 100,000 well-prepared students prepared for our current curricula every year. What are we getting now? 40. So I'm not putting money on that bridge happening when the kind of situation unfortunately exists in the schools at the moment. To say this is not to write off the schools, absolutely cannot be done, nor is it to say we should not keep the pressure on the schools. But in my view, the pressure on the schools must be to attain achievable goals. And to ask for 150,000 for now, students who can reach our inherited higher education assumptions is not realistic. And if it is, colleagues, I would love to see the plan that sets out how that is going to be achieved and how long it might take. Well, there are tens of thousands of students failing every year who don't need to. So, overwhelming evidence, effectively no prospect of our problems being solved from that quarter. And this leaves higher education with its own clear choice, practical and moral. We either accept the status quo or we actually act on factors that are within our control to address this gap and the existing underpreparedness. And I think you will see that it's quite a complex thing to do. And it's a big choice for us. And many people are not willing to make it at the moment, in my experience. Let history be the judge. So, why a curriculum? Well, first of all, the curriculum structure is in fact the framework for everything we do. If we have a good one, it enables us to do what we need to do. If we don't, it simply constrains us. And that is what is happening at the moment. And note, please, colleagues, that our structure that we have now was inherited nearly 100 years ago and has scarcely changed in its structure since, even though the rest of the world has changed around it. It was based on a small, privileged, homogeneous student body. We still have very bright students coming in, but from quite different backgrounds. So surely now is the time to move decisively on this, to say let's keep the best of what we have got. And we've got lots of good stuff. But to change those elements of it that are holding us back. That is our argument. And we think we can change them without throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And we must ask ourselves, we're dealing with our top 10%. Let's push that to 15 or something. Why would the top 10% of our students not do well if they are given the right conditions in which to learn? Somehow people worry about that. We can't do this. We can't create the right kind of curricula. We don't have to have entirely revolutionary teaching methods. All over the world, higher education is robust and students learn. What kind of pessimism is it that grips us and say somehow or other we cannot achieve this? Or this university can, but the rest can't. That's a terrible indictment to me. So we have to ask ourselves, who is benefiting from the status quo? And I'm not going to go into it, but it's certainly not the majority population groups or the majority of our student intake, given that we are losing 50%. And you know who we're losing, largely. It is the less privileged of both races, all races, I mean. So a bit further, I don't want to be technical here, but just to give you a quick flavor. There are 4 big things that we really have to do in our curriculum structure to be able to make serious progress. One is to deal with this articulation gap between school and higher education. Another one is to recognize that there are huge literacy problems for our students, not of their own making. Throughout Africa, we teach in a medium of instruction that is not the home language of the vast majority of students. And we know that, and it has huge ramifications in the academic use of language. It's a major disadvantage for many students who are already disadvantaged by schools and in some cases poverty in their homes. But we're not able to put it in place. We know how, but we can't. Then there are what we've discovered, it's a very fascinating topic, how many curricula have key transitions within them for which students are differentially prepared. Engineering is always the case we use. 5 big transitions. Basic sciences to engineering sciences, another world. Engineering sciences into complex problems that don't have simple answers. From taking in knowledge to design, engineering design. And for people who grow up in certain circumstances, it seems to come more naturally than others. But many students flounder in that. And finally, project management and research in engineering is another huge one. And in medicine, for example, it's, I'm looking at colleagues here, that huge transition from the preclinical to the clinical phase knocks out a lot of very talented students. There are things all in so many curricula of this kind. And you will see, colleagues, that fixing the school system won't address that, because it does not come out of schooling. It comes out of people's cultural capital and all of that sort of stuff. And finally, we would like, although there will be limited room, to enhance our curricula, and by increasing breadth a bit, we'll have limited time, but we need to try to get our curriculum more in shape with the needs of the contemporary world. Those are 4 big things that we need to do. Even if we take the first 3, we can't do them. We can't do any of them because we are constrained by the absence of sufficient curriculum space or time on task within our current structures. We are stuck. Conclusion. I'll leave it to you to read for yourselves. Excuse me. The suitcase is really cool. It's wonderful for a challenge to be able to look down on people. I was contemplating, I see I've got just under 7 minutes left. I was contemplating what time would be best to spectacularly fall off the suitcase to get your attention, but maybe the time is too short and you never know what will happen. So duration here, colleagues, is a signal for more time on task. If you want to use summer schools and all that sort of thing, yes, but most people can't afford them. The critical thing is more mediated time. Otherwise, we can't do any of those critical things. So this is not silly, airy-fairy stuff. And finally, as I've said, we have to address the diversity of educational background amongst our students. It's a key characteristic. Other countries tend to deal with it through institutional stratification. You go to a community college if you come from a certain kind of background, and you're limited in that way. We are not doing that at the moment in any overt way, and I think we've got to be very careful about re-ghettoizing our higher education system on grounds of both race and class. So we have no one-size-fits-all structure that can possibly suit us. And moving from one rigid structure to another is not going to deal with that issue. So hence the need for a flexible structure that will allow all of those students who are currently graduating in the current regulation time to continue to do so. Why not? That's perfectly doable. I won't go into all of the detail. Just to say that these proposals don't come out of thin air. They are based on experience over 3 decades in various forms of academic development, including the so-called extended curriculum programs that we have now, that only reach about 15% of our total student intake, and we need to reach more like 60 somehow. We did excellent exemplars. I think it's one of the best things we did in the project was to commission these expert teams. I really would commend the exemplars. They're at the back of the report to your attention, particularly those in your specific area. They're in engineering, commerce, humanities, etc., etc. Okay. So it's not just pie in the sky. Now, in the little time that's left to me, I want to address the big issue of implementability and particularly money. Because it's intuitive to say, are we adding a year to the degree? You're adding a third of the cost. One more. Okay. For those of you who thought 25% of the cost, go to the bottom of the class. Okay. It's a third extra that people would assume. So, but it's not like that. Because, colleagues, we are paying for a huge amount of failure in the system. That 5 billion we are paying largely for failure. If we redirect some of that, sadly we can't redirect all of it, we will be doing pretty well. 5 minutes. So I'm going to give you some quick numbers, prove that we're not talking nonsense. The modeling has been very intricate, done by a wonderful man called Charles Shepard, who did all of the work for the Cyril Ramaphosa Commission on the new funding framework for higher education. It's been vetted by none other than Anthony Melk from Pretoria and Rolf Stumpf, both of whom are daunting experts in this matter. So we are very confident about the validity of the figures. The assumptions behind them of some improved efficiency through the extra time, the foundational work that students are doing, will always be up for discussion, but we believe they are very modest. On that scenario, we've got these two things here. Scenario one is our proposal, and you will see that if we have the same intake as now, we would project getting 28% more graduates at a cost, additional cost of only 16%. Why is there cost? Because retaining students successfully in the system pushes up enrollments. Right? That must do. That's what we should be doing, is keeping our students longer. I hope that our system is not predicated on the kind of failure levels that we have at the moment. But we do have to find money for that, and I'll come to an alternative in a minute. If we take the other route of simply pushing people in at the front end without making our system more efficient, and if we don't do anything, colleagues, that is exactly what will happen. What will change? So if we do that, we must assume that the average level of preparedness comes down a bit. And again, we've made modest assumptions about that. And if that happens, you will see that the cost goes above the number of graduates, extra graduates produced. It's 38% more cost to do 28% more graduates. That's common sense. Look at the cost per graduate. Under this scenario, we save 10% per graduate on quite modest assumptions because of additional efficiency, whereas the other scenario will cost 20% more. That adds up by the time we get to 1.5 million. Over the full cohort period, say 6 years, the additional cost of the expensive scenario over the other one for every cohort in the system, every new intake, is 1.8 billion. Multiply that by 4, because that is the number of cohorts in the system at any given time. What if there's no more money at all that comes in? Well, bang goes growth, doesn't it? Right off. But what we can do, of course, efficiency always works. You can find a happy medium here between producing 28% more graduates with the same intake, which will cost a little bit more, or reduce that. You can even reduce your intake, although that's politically not very acceptable at the moment. There are ways in which to do this. Efficiency works. So we can do this even if we have no more money coming into the system. Nearly done. Just to make the point a bit more, this is the plot of the unproductive use of subsidy in the system. Don't worry too much about the bottom 3 lines. They are the different qualification types. Again, the total is on the top line. You will see the status quo on the left, hovering under 1.2 billion. That's the figure I mentioned. 4 cohorts, 4.8 billion. That's the nearly 5. Nearly 5 is a bit of a stretch, okay, but it sounds better than sort of 4.8. You will see that there's a 25% saving of reduction of loss if we use the more efficient system. And if we don't, look what growth does. It goes, this is just for the 28% more graduates, not the 50, thank you. Roaring up, don't worry about the 28 at the moment, it goes up to 50% additional unproductive use of subsidy. Just as the second last one, of course, cost to students, very crucial. And the students, we've communicated very badly with the students about this. On average, same outlay. Some students may well pay more. If we make a mistake and put somebody onto a 4-year program who could get through in 3, they'll pay more. There'll be few. But the great number more will actually pay less because it's more efficient. We can show this in the figures. And most importantly, achieve the qualification rather than dropping out. Because if you drop out, you lose your total investment. Remember the graph? The big spikes at the end, those are the people that will be the major beneficiaries of a different system. Academic staff resources, I'm not going to talk about in detail. It's one of those issues I've chosen to duck, but we can talk about them later. What we can say is that we would not be worse off in terms of what the subsidy would generate. That's all I want to say at the moment. Overall conclusion on affordability, this would be the most resource-efficient way of achieving graduate growth in all respects. I just want to say one last thing. This is all about contributing to addressing inequalities. At the individual level, that's what we've got to do, is develop students who are not well developed at present. That is our task. So how do we deal with these inequalities? First of all, at the individual level, by making a new system the norm, last slide, we change the stigma effect. We believe hugely. We've seen effects of that in many AD programs recently. And critically, colleagues, I think we need to be moving towards normalizing our higher education system. In 300 years, or however long we've had it, we've never had a normal higher education system that properly serves all of our communities. Surely it's about time to start moving towards that. A system that genuinely deals with the majority of the students coming in. And what we can do here is enable much larger number of students actually to achieve decent outcomes. And at the institutional level, something very similar. It's a different basis for differentiation. At institution like mine at UCT, probably still a minority of students would require the lengthened curriculum, although not in all cases. But in many other institutions, the vast majority require that and would benefit from it. And the resources generated by this new scheme would go there, primarily to assist with the responsibility of developing the underdeveloped students. I hope you will give this your serious consideration. Thank you for listening to me.